The topic is the limits to growth. A very popular book, the first report to the Club of Rome, and it made the club famous. What did it say? Most people have a strong opinion on what it said, which is not what it did say. The small book technically is a collection of 12 scenarios for the future, scenarios from the year 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of the scenarios are sad scenarios, pessimistic scenarios where something went wrong in the 21st century. In this case, a resource crisis, resources becoming scarce, very expensive, drawing investment into that sector at the cost of other sectors declining. And 6 of the scenarios were positive scenarios where humanity managed to introduce a certain element of sustainability into the quality of life of people. The important message in the limits to growth that seems to have forgone anyone's attention, all those 9 million people who allegedly read the book, is that we could not tell which of those 12 scenarios was the most likely one. Science hadn't progressed sufficiently at the time that it was possible to make an educated guess on how society was going to respond to this physical reality, and consequently we couldn't tell which of these scenarios was the most likely one. However, now we are 50 years down the line, and you are experiencing something that probably has never happened before, that someone is still alive 50 years after the fact with a computer model, and it is possible to say, you know, what did happen? And I will show you what happened, because the only thing that is of scientific substance is to ask the question, which of those 12 scenarios has the world actually followed? That's the only thing, that's the only way in which you can test the thing. And in order to do so, here are the 12 scenarios for from the Limits to Growth book for population. So this is if there was any forecast of population developments in that book, here it is. You know, from stabilized population at the bottom, you know, to populations that grow very big at the top or collapse in between. So all one can do, scientifically speaking, is to ask what has happened since. So if this doesn't, oh God. I mean, here I do rely on technology advance. So this is what has happened since. So the world population has developed well within the fan of opportunities indicated in the Limits to Growth book. Can any conclusion be drawn from this about limits being right? No. Can any conclusion be drawn about limits being wrong? No. The only thing you can say is that the choice of futures described in the 1972 book at least covered what actually happened in the population area during this period. Let us move to another one, industrial output per capita, which was the measure of consumption and production per person in the analysis. Here you see, once more, the world has grown economically just in the middle of the scenarios from Limits to Growth. So no big surprise. Of course, someone might have expected there to be a collapse between 1970 and 2018. We did not, and consequently you see the world has evolved more or less center of the 12. I'll be faster on the next one. This is food per capita. This is the amount of food that the world has actually produced per person over the last 50 years. And here you see that limits was wrong. All the 12 scenarios in the Limits to Growth book expected the world to produce more food than the world has actually done over the last 50 years. Which is very interesting. So it means that limits was excessively optimistic about the future, not excessively pessimistic, which is, of course, the general perception of the thing. But this is until now. Of course, this doesn't say anything about what will happen during the next 50 years, but at least we can see that on this score, you can say that limits was wrong. All the scenarios included in the book were too optimistic on the food side, which is interesting. On the resource side, this is what has happened, which supports, first of all, the resource use over the last 50 years has not been as excessive as in most of the pessimistic scenarios from the limits to growth, but it is well within the fan of scenarios. And then finally, there is the pollution sector in the limits to growth model. Here is the accumulated level of pollution in the 12 different scenarios. And then I have simply added the temperature, which is a measure of the accumulated pollution activity of the world. And so the world has done slightly worse on the pollution side, on the carbon emissions sides, but that is, of course, a question of how you scale the graph, etc. So more or less the same. So that's what you can say after 50 years is that model analysis relatively good on those scores where you can see something clear. Limits was too optimistic. Very interesting. What was the real message of the limits to growth? The real message was not a forecast. It was not a message that oil will run out by 2000 or that the world will go to hell, within the next election period, or that the finance sector is going to collapse quickly. The real message, if you really read the thing and see what we tried to say, these are the 4 things. I apologize for the fact that very obviously we wrote the book so unpedagogic that the 4 messages did not get through. All people at this point in time perceive the limits as having said something completely different from what it actually did say. What it did say, it said, point number 1, the Earth is finite. And it is finite even if there is technological development, because technological development takes time. And so if the growth rate is fast enough, technologies will not keep up. The second message is that, and this Anders had discovered, the main message is that the footprint of humanity, the resource use and the pollution output cannot grow forever on a finite planet. Clearly, GDP can grow forever on a finite planet. GDP is a measure of human activity levels and assessed at market value. Clearly, I can give better and better talks over time and be paid by nicer and nicer paintings, valued at higher and higher rates. It's totally possible to run an economy where the economy grows measured as GDP, as long as the footprint stays within the physical boundaries of the planet. We didn't manage to get that message across at the time. We didn't manage to get it across during the ensuing 40 to 50 years. The third point, which is very important, is that there are multiple limits. There isn't only one resource limit or one pollution limit. There are many. So you need a systems perspective. You cannot just dive into peak oil and look at peak oil as the problem. You have to keep at the same time an eye at the agriculture sector and the social sector and distribution and inequity and the whole spiel. So we are living in an onion with lots of shells outside us. And if we grow and bump into one of the shells, and remove it, there is just the other one coming. So please have a long time horizon and please be broad. And then finally, the word global collapse ended up being the catchword associated with limits to growth. it shouldn't. You know, the world will not collapse, as I see it, and as my colleagues see it, from physical limitations. What will happen is that we will get an increasingly unpleasant world of social decline, where institutions start, where there is social strife, conflict, things are much less pleasant, etc. So it's the social system that is going to actually go down the hill. It is not necessarily the GDP, because the GDP will increase when we start using a lot of manpower and capital to build dikes around Holland, you know, in order to try to dig new tunnels or channels for the big rivers. You know, when we in Switzerland are trying to put covers over the glaciers so that they should not melt so fast. All of this adds to human activity, so the GDP is going to continue while, you know, the social well-being, happiness, etc., starts to decline. So we should have spoken about social collapse rather than physical collapses. And I apologize for these things, and it's really, as a professor, this is really bad marks. You know, the guys had 4 things they wanted to tell the world, and they got the opportunity of the Club of Rome spreading the message. And still, we didn't do it because of unclear presentation of the fundamental ideas. You know, friends of mine say, Jorgen, don't be depressed. The reason is that people did not want to hear your real message. And so they chose to interpret the message in the way they did interpret it, which is, of course, very well written in Ugo Bardi's fantastic book about how the misperceptions of what Limits said actually evolved during the 30-year period. So, what will happen next? So we know what has happened this far. What next? Okay, luckily, I wrote this book. I spent a year thinking about the issue in 2011, and in 2012, I published the 40-year anniversary book of the Limits to Growth. It's called 2052. It's a global forecast for the next 40 years. It is not a scenario analysis. It is a forecast. This is the old Jorgen, who accumulates all the information and knowledge that had been accumulated during the forerunning 40 years, trying to say whether it is possible to say something about how the world is actually going to react to the emerging physical limitations. And it is put in writing here. It is also embodied in a new computer model so that you can have a check. This one has been printed in 170,000 copies in 10 languages. The interesting thing is only 10% of those copies are in the English language. You know, this is largely in China, Japan, Germany, etc. And this, again, is obvious because what this book says in big letters is that the liberal market economies are not going to solve the problem. The problem will be solved better in places with strong government. And so I was incredibly pleased to hear Ernst choosing from the endless number of things he could have said 2 minutes ago when he stepped down. You know, he chose strong government as the thing. I think strong government is the new bold initiative that Gunter is calling for. Supporting, you know, not the liberal market economy, but one where, you know, people get the opportunity to do intelligent long-term action. So, what does 2052 say about the future? And I'll do the same thing. I'll just run through the scenarios for Limits to Growth, the 1972 scenarios, and I'll tell you what the 2052 forecast is. I still believe that the 2052 forecast is a good forecast. It has been right at least the first 6 years. So this is what the world population is going to do to 2050. It will stabilize around 9 billion people in 2050. Because, of course, the fertility rates in most of the world are sinking dramatically. It's only in Africa that we don't have the really dramatic decline. It will come, either because of education or because of hunger. On the economy side, the forecast is that economic development is going to continue. The Chinese are going to, yet another four-doubling of their economic activity level, and many of the emerging economies are going to do the same. The West will stagnate. Hi, Johan. On the food side, very interestingly, the forecast is that, finally, over the next 40 years, we will do yet another increase in the food per capita of the order of 20 to 30%. And since the population is also increasing, this means that the food sector will probably produce 50% more food in 2050 than now. And so here you see the forecast moves back into the fan of opportunities made in 1972. On the resource side, we will leave in the ground quite a bit of the coal, oil, and gas that exists. And on the climate side, the forecast is like this. We will reach 2.5 degrees centigrade, is my forecast made 6 years ago, peaking in 2075, because emissions are going to peak in the 30s, roughly. Which of the limits to growth scenarios is this that is embedded in the 2052 forecast? The way I see it, this is what is called the pollution crisis. So the world, as I see it, is, if one has to choose one of the 12 scenarios, it looks as if it is the pollution crisis from 1972, which is the most likely one. And it is greenhouse gases, and particularly carbon dioxide, which is fulfilling the role of what we called persistent pollution in 1972. And it is the temperature, the global warming, which fulfills the historical role of being the pollution level that actually in the long run does not stop the economy, but leads to declining well-being, more social strife, very unhappy, weather forecasts, the sea level rise of another foot or two in this thing. And so that is the future. Let us then, since I do believe that the pollution scenario, which is scenario number 2 in the 1972 book, is the most likely, we have spent the last several years trying to study the pollution scenario in some more detail. My friends and I have done a lot of modeling work in this area to try to clarify what will actually happen and what could be done about it. And so what we do think will happen, the top here is the annual greenhouse gas emissions from human activity from 1900 to 2015 is shaded. Our forecast is dotted, which means that humanity will decide on sufficient slowing down of greenhouse gas activities to reach a peak in the 2030s, and then it will be down to current levels more or less in 2050, and then it will go out during the next 50 years. CO2 is a significant part of global warming, but it is not all. But the Kyoto gases and the Montreal gases are normally neglected in graphs like this. Here you have both of them. The CO2 is, however, 70% roughly of the problem, and consequently is 70% of the solution. Where does the CO2 come from? The man-made CO2 largely comes from burning of coal, burning of oil, and burning of gas. So instead of looking at the 250 different things one can do in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the simplest thing is to look at, how can we stop using coal, oil, and gas? Because if one stops using coal, oil, and gas, then a major part of the human greenhouse gas emissions will disappear. So we do experiments. This is the temperature development if man follows the most likely future. You see the temperature leveling off roughly at 2.5 degrees centigrade in 2075. So this is what will happen if all greenhouse gases are stopped by 2100. So this is above Paris. It does not mean that the civilization will come to an end in 2075, but it means that the world will be incredibly much more unpleasant than it is at this point in time. Most of the things that you love will have been tampered with in some way or the other. My wife and I wanted to go snorkeling this fall to see the final, view before we die of old age, of the wonders of the subsea corals. It turns out that now all fancy resorts to which we would like to go no longer take customers because of the bleaching of the coral reefs. So now we had to postpone until next April Philippines in order to get to a place where they could guarantee that the coral reefs are not yet destroyed. And this happens without anyone shedding a tear. I'm furious. And there will be more of this. Just in order to indicate to you what types of future this is. This will go along with roughly this much sea level rise in that period to 2075. This does not bother Norwegians at all. We have steep coastlines, and this is not going to do anything. We'll just lift the level of some of the piers by a little bit. This is much worse for Bangladesh, where lifting the sea level by this much, deprives them of a large territory. But, however, the Indians have already built the fence along the northern coast of Bangladesh in order to make absolutely sure that they don't run into the problem of the EU and following the advice of the Americans, who built, of course, the fence vis-à-vis Mexico already 20 years ago. So this is the type of future. This is what global collapse is going to look like at the ground. It's social decline. It's well-being disappearing. It's not the economy disappearing.
So,
yes, I'm now getting to the end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you don't worry, you've had your 30 minutes.
I have.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I live from giving talks, and the worst thing I know...
Well, you're not living from giving this one.
Yes. I'm living for giving this one. So, 2 more clicks. So the question is, here again, I've now collected on one graph man-made emissions of greenhouse gases, and to the right, the resulting temperature. So let's assume that people listen to me. I don't think they will, but assume that they listen to me, and assume that we managed to cut CO2 in a linear fashion from 2020 to 2080. That's the same as halving CO2 emissions by 2050, which is something many people are working for. So that means that emissions go down like the blue line, and you see the temperature then reaches a peak slightly earlier and slightly lower. So we are just above 2 degrees centigrade in that case. So it doesn't really solve the Paris Agreement. So then we go for my alternative, which is cutting linearly CO2 from now to 2050, which is the green line. Sorry, which you see holds the temperature just below 2 degrees centigrade. So that is basically what should be done from my point of view. One should aim for phasing out the use of coal, oil, and gas by 2050. What else should be done? Well, that is the topic of Johan, because Johan and I have spent the last year with our friends and colleagues trying to look at this in some more detail. And as I told the members yesterday, I'm not going to steal the thunder from Johan's talk. He will tell you that in addition to phasing out coal, oil, and gas, there are a few things that Sandrine will have to make the Club of Rome support. But I leave this to him and said basically that the major problem we are facing is the fact that those things that the world needs in order to become sustainable and to live within limits are not in the short-term interest of business, nor in the short-term interest of the voter. The solutions are more expensive. The needed solutions are typically more expensive than the dirty solutions. Consequently, competing business cannot implement them. And the solutions normally involves closure of dirty jobs before the clean jobs arise. And consequently, most people are also against this move. And that is the core challenge. Phase out fossil fuels by 2050. Thank you.